Well, good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. Tonight we continue with Episode 8 of our Hail to the Chiefs presidential series, co-presented by our good friends at the Truman Library Institute and co-sponsored by KCUR's Up to Date, which this morning broadcast an interview with tonight's speaker, Dr. John Robert Greene, Professor of History and Communications at Cazenovia College and author of The Presidency of George Bush, published by the University Press of Kansas. George H.W. Bush, or 41, as he has come to be known, is the first president in this series of whom I have a serious living memory. Indeed, I spent the entire 4 years of the first Bush administration as a resident of the District of Columbia. This is not to say that I knew President Bush. In fact, I only even saw him once, and that was from afar. In late spring 1991, during the Victory Parade marking the conclusion of the First Gulf War. But I did know a lot of people who interacted with President Bush or attended White House dinners or other functions in which he was in attendance, and thus I was always privy to one tidbit or another. My favorite one goes like this. It was late 1989, early 1990. The Berlin Wall had come down. The Iron Curtain had been dismantled. The Soviet Union was imploding. The Cold War, in short, seemed to be coming to an end. And for a few brief, giddy moments, we thought we had won. Around this time, a friend of mine was in the receiving line at a White House dinner. The person right in front of him, an older woman from that breed of Washingtonians known as cave dwellers. That's to say the people whose families have lived in D.C. for generations, apparently knew Barbara Bush personally and thus was engaged in more than cursory conversation with the First Lady. My friend overheard this little snippet of dialogue. "Isn't it amazing about the fall of the Iron Curtain?" this woman gushed to Mrs. Bush. "Yes," the First Lady replied. "It is amazing, but do you know what's even more amazing? George actually thinks he had something to do with it." Well, much as I would like to continue regaling you with third-hand anecdotes, I think you deserve the real thing. And to do that, we've brought in someone who did know President George H.W. Bush. I am speaking, of course, of Richard S. Berkeley, the only three-term mayor in the history of Kansas City, and I think perhaps the only card-carrying Republican to claim the mayor's office in the modern era. So to give you a formal introduction of tonight's speaker, please welcome a great friend of the library, Dick Berkeley.
Thank you, Henry. I don't think I can top that story, to be very frank. Good evening. I believe we are in for a real treat tonight when we listen to someone who is really very, very versed in the subject. When we listen to John Robert Greene. I consider it a special occasion because Dr. Greene is an excellent historian, particularly with regards to recent presidents of the United States. He has the ability, tenacity, and skills to go where necessary, to research the subject, and discuss with many people the individuals involved or the issues involved. He gets permission to use their name whenever possible, but in many cases he does it from a point of view of he will attribute to an unknown source, but very, very often he is allowed to use the other person's name, and that makes a better book. Either way, he gets the information he needs. He has written 17 books. In addition to this great book that you're going to hear about tonight on President Bush, I was going to say known as 41, but that's already been said by. He has written books on the Nixon and Ford years, another on Mrs. Betty Ford, as well as President George W. Bush. His doctoral dissertation was on the subject of the 1952 election, which involved a primary on the Republican side between Senators Robert Taft and former General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it was later turned into a book which was well received. He has been involved in many documentaries, exhibits, as well as numerous radio and TV programs. He has taught and lectured at many universities. He has also had the wisdom to have some of his books published, as was mentioned previously, by the University Press of Kansas. I was pleased that I was asked to do the introduction tonight. Henry Fortunato suggested I make the introduction and include some comments of my own experiences with President Bush, who I consider one of the very top elected officials I've ever met. He is a man of knowledge, experience, and dedication. He is a very personable and modest leader. I was fortunate to have met him probably around 45 years ago and to fly with him in a small 5-seater plane to a meeting in Topeka. Sandy and I were lucky enough to be invited to a presidential state dinner when he was the vice president. We were with him for a visit just a short time before he was selected by President Ronald Reagan to be his vice president. I also had the opportunity to introduce him at a meeting at the music hall. I ended by saying that he was the second most revered person in the White House, after Barbara Bush, of course. He took the demotion with a great smile. Another interesting experience happened when President Bush was in Kansas City to review our activities with regard to the drug problem. We toured various areas, and then we had a serious meeting. Al Brooks, a real leader in the anti-drug effort, was sitting on one side of the president, and I was on the other. Newsweek took a photograph of us. The next week, when I looked in the magazine, there was a great picture in there. President Bush, and of course, Al Brooks. I kept looking, but there was no one else. These were a few of the opportunities we had had in getting to know the president better than perhaps the average person. But let's get back to the reason that I'm here, and that is to introduce our speaker. As I said before, I look forward to hearing Professor John Robert Greene tell us about this outstanding American. Thank you. Professor.
How many people can say that they got introduced by Dick Berkeley? What a thrill. It reminds me of Lyndon Johnson when he would be introduced and get a gracious introduction like that. He said, that introduction sounded like it was written by my father, but my mother never would have believed it. Thank you so much for having me, but before I start, there's somebody that I want you to meet, if you haven't met him already. He's sitting in the back with a white hat on. Willie, I want you to stand up. I came here today I have met so many wonderful people here, but Willie got me ready for this presentation, sailed me through everything, and allowed me to go back to the hotel and take a nap. So that was a really, really good deal. I come to you from a place where yesterday it was 75 degrees. Thank you very much. Cazenovia College is in upstate New York, about 20 miles from Syracuse. It's a small independent college. We have about 1,000 students. It seems on some days that I teach every single one of them. And I want to thank our alumni from Caz College for being here tonight. Seems you had a baseball game here a couple of days ago. But where I am most familiar with Kansas City sports is from this place, because when my team comes in here, Oh, boo, come on, give me a break. I want to start out tonight by telling you what I do for a living. I do not collect factual information and give it to the public unvarnished. I've written a couple of encyclopedias, they all stink, because they're nothing but factual information. What a historian really wants to do, and what a historian really wants to do with their students, is to get them to tell you what they think about those facts, to think towards a judgment, to think towards a thesis. What do you think about George Bush? Not what do you know, but what do you think? And the question that was posed by this series, and by a superb book that is available for you out in the hallway. I got a kid in law school, I've got a kid who's studying physical therapy, I got bills up to here. This book makes great Labor Day giving. Was this question. It's the most often asked question about George Bush. This is my answer. Good play on words. I can write. Far more, by the way, than just the answer to the question that the series posed, this is the story of the presidency of George H.W. Bush, what conservatives did to him. So this isn't going to be a survey of every single detail of the Bush administration. For that, like I said, there's a great book. But a defense of this thesis. You may see other things that you want to talk about. And that's why I'm really looking forward to what I have been told here is a particularly vibrant question and answer session. Now, beginning at the beginning is not always the best strategy when defending a thesis, but here it's quite useful. Does Bush's background give any hints to the type of leader that he would become? His ideology? Was he born a conservative? Who was he? Well, he came from a background that certainly, if nothing else, looked like it was conservative. Old money, Victorian values. His father, Prescott Bush, preached against conspicuous consumption. His mother, Dorothy Bush, preached a love of competition, both in life and in sports, but also respect for their station. But this was no conservative Republican. Prescott Bush made a name for himself in the 1950s as senator from Connecticut by being one of the first senators to come out against Joseph McCarthy. So Bush does not come from old guard Robert Taft type stock. Prep school at Andover, learned the behavior of his class, and then he began to rebel. His father did not want him to enlist in the Navy in World War II. He was only 17 years old, but he enlisted and became one of the youngest pilots in the Navy. He flew Grumman 3-man TBF torpedo bombers. And he flew 32 hours of missions before he was shot down over Chichijima. And this is a rather rare picture, actually. On the right in the raft is George Bush, as the crew of the USS Finback pulls him out of the Pacific Ocean. As it was for thousands of other young men, many of whom are here in this audience, World War II was the formative experience of his life. It gave him an extreme sense of duty. He re-upped after being shot down. That was a golden mission. He was able to go home, but he re-enlisted, saying, and I quote, this is what he told me, "It was different then. We had to go back and do our duty. I had no choice." And it shaped a particular portion of his worldview. Coming out of World War II, George Bush saw the world in good versus evil. It's going to come back to us in a few moments when he deals with Noriega and Saddam Hussein. He was part of the GI bulge, the thousands of young men. George Bush, although he was of independent means, went to college on the GI Bill. He went to Yale, graduated in 1948, and then instead of becoming a strap hanger, instead of going into the family business, George Bush decides to go out on an adventure. And where do you want to go when you go out on an adventure? You go to Texas. Rather than go into the family oil business, George Bush becomes a wildcatter, which was catch as catch can. You know, you drilled, and if it came up oil, you were rich, and if it didn't, you were going back to Greenwich, Connecticut. First Dresser Oil, then his own company, Zapata Oil, a businessman but with an independent streak. Then Bush decides to do something that his father also suggested that he not do: enter into politics. Bush went into politics and started a string of public service that was envied by the time he entered the vice presidency. From his first loss to Ralph Yarborough, to 2 terms in the United States Congress. And what's important about this is that Bush comes out, and like his father, Bush develops as a rather progressive Republican. In his 2 terms for Congress, Bush surprises everyone by being in favor of the various civil rights bills that the Johnson administration was putting forth. It was the reason that a conservative Democrat, Lloyd Bentsen, was able to beat George Bush's brains in 1970 and paint him as too liberal, George Bush as too liberal for Texas. Think about that one for a second. Is there anybody too liberal for Texas? Once he lost, the Nixon administration gave him a consolation prize. It was where Bush began to practice his worldview as a very good ambassador to the United Nations during the Vietnam era. In 1972, Bush was called up to one of the 2 jobs that he told me he hated in his life: shilling for Richard Nixon as the chairman of the Republican National Committee. It was Bush who was responsible for going out and defending Nixon during the Watergate crisis, long after Bush had privately decided that Nixon had to step down. In 1974, because of his loyalty, Bush ends up on Jerry Ford's short list. And kind of interesting, when I interviewed President Ford for another book that I had written, Ford told me privately that he wished that he had appointed Bush vice president instead of Nelson Rockefeller, and that he thought that he might have been able to beat Jimmy Carter with Bush by his side in 1976. Who knows? But Bush was passed over for Nelson Rockefeller, and this time Bush was able to pick the job that he wanted. And he goes to China. He was not our ambassador. We didn't have formal relations with the country. He was our chief envoy. And remember this experience when in a moment we talk about Tiananmen Square. He was called back in a bit of a palace coup in 1975 by Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. There's some interesting people in this photograph. President Ford, Dick Cheney looking like he's paying attention right there in the middle. George Bush pointing at what Dick Cheney should be paying attention to. And on the far left is a very young and intent Brent Scowcroft. Bush served at the CIA as DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, in the years after the Watergate investigations of the CIA, and brought back a great deal of comfort, if not respect, comfort to the CIA. Bush left the CIA, well, he left under protest. Jimmy Carter didn't re-up him, and he decides in 1979 to run for the Republican nomination for the presidency. He wins in Iowa against Reagan, but then the Reagan machine just runs roughshod over him. This is the famous debate in New Hampshire where Ronald Reagan turns to him and he says, "I paid for this microphone, sir." And Bush never really recovered after that. but he knew when to get out. He got out before he had lost too many primaries, and he stayed on good terms with people on Reagan's staff and got the ultimate consolation prize in 1980. In a lot of ways, this is the odd couple. The Reagan staff hated Bush. Nancy Reagan hated Bush. Bush distrusted the true believing conservative Reaganites. But he served with absolute loyalty, particularly through the rocky waters of Iran-Contra. So in 1987, when he finally announces his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination, the press immediately christens him as just another conservative, yuppie Republican. But in reality, George Bush had become a moderate Republican. He was nowhere near as progressive as his father, but he was hardly a conservative ideologue. So he already is arousing suspicions from within the conservative wing on the party, and he couldn't count on their support in the primaries. There were more conservative candidates than he: Bob Dole, Pat Robertson. So, how'd this happen? It happened because George Bush recognized that he could not campaign as an ideologue. He couldn't campaign as a conservative. You couldn't win by campaigning to the right. Good lesson for today. You did it by constructing a campaign that made it difficult to label you at all. The 1988 election from the Bush side was a campaign that assiduously avoided issues and replaced them with negative imagery. But this isn't George Bush's thing. If I say this once tonight, I'll say it 1,000 times and mean it. This is the nicest man that I have ever met in politics, and I've met Jerry Ford. This is the nicest man that I've met in politics. So what Bush had to do was bring a team in that could get good in a knife fight. And it wasn't these two guys. Jim Baker and Bob Mossbacher, on the left strategy, on the right money, were at the top of the campaign, but it was this man, Lee Atwater, Strom Thurmond's attack dog, who came into the Bush campaign and wove one of the sharpest, most thoughtful, best reacted negative campaigns in presidential history. And those words are, by the way, not contradictory, not in any way. It was a strategy free of ideology that was helped by the fact that Bush got smacked around in Iowa and comes in after Pat Robertson, trails Pat Robertson, and Bush was now focused, listening to Lee Atwater. And when they went into New Hampshire, Bush turned the reins of this negative campaign over to another attack dog, Governor John Sununu, who worked very closely with Lee Atwater and with Roger Ailes, who is now, is he still president of Fox or something like that? I mean, Ailes was the communications director for the New Hampshire wing of the campaign and then stayed on for the rest of the campaign and into the Bush White House. And they created a wonderful advertisement that said that Bob Dole was going to raise taxes. There was only one problem. Bob Dole was not going to raise taxes, never said he was going to raise taxes. What they knew was that every time that Bob Dole protested against the ad, he sounded shrill and angry just like Bob Dole does. And they got him into a defensive mode. Bush wins New Hampshire, and after Super Tuesday, with Mossbacher's money pouring in, it was all over. Now, Bush comes into the convention in 1988, and he realizes that he's got to give the conservatives something. He gives them two things. The first thing that he gave them was one of the few times you will hear a presidential candidate actually make an ironclad promise. It's one of the most famous moments.
Raise taxes and I'll say no, and they'll push and I'll say no, and they'll push again and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
We'll get back in a moment to why he would say something like that. Peggy Noonan, who crafted the line, said that she wanted to write something, quote, that sounded good, unquote. But that certainly was conservative mantra. I'm not going to raise taxes. And then he gave the conservatives a young conservative. When this book came out, my Bush book, one of the lines that was most quoted in the press was where I said that the choice of Dan Quayle was, and I quote myself because I can do that, political genius. And it was. Dan Quayle brought everything to the ticket that George Bush wanted of a young conservative. Young, Midwestern, family values. But then Dan Quayle opened his mouth. And it was serious trouble after, but he was able, even through the troubles of his own youth, which really, and I met the former vice president, it was youth and inexperience that led him to the troubles in the campaign, not mismanagement. But the conservatives still liked having him on the ticket, and they felt that they had been mollified. The issues from Atwater were perfect. The first, wrap Bush in the flag. Remember the thing where they said that Michael Dukakis wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance, and now Bush would say the Pledge of Allegiance, and everybody was wearing little flags. The second was to paint Dukakis. Oh, great, I struck a nerve. The second was to paint Dukakis as, if you'll remember, a card-carrying member of the American Civil Liberties Union, which he wasn't, but that didn't matter. And while we're on the subject of lying, the famous Willie Horton ad. Lee Atwater approved but not written. The ad that said that Michael Dukakis had okayed a furlough program, which he had not, to give furlough to weekend passes to convicted murderers. That wasn't what the furlough program was all about. The real problem was not all this, but that Dukakis couldn't do anything about it. Dukakis was the perfect candidate to get hurt by a negative campaign because he did not come out swinging. You might remember Bernie Shaw of CNN asking Dukakis in this debate what he would do. Would he be in favor of the death penalty if Kitty Dukakis was raped and murdered? And he went off on a 5-minute answer that sounded like he had swallowed an encyclopedia. It was deadly dull, and the only thing that anybody came away with was that this man did not care. Or the famous Snoopy picture. Why Dukakis allowed himself to get photographed in it, it was easy to make fun of. It was a landslide. And it was Lee Atwater's landslide. But only 43% of the American people on Election Day had a favorable opinion of George Bush. They voted for him, but they weren't sure that they liked him. What would he become now as president? Well, the answer appeared immediately. George Bush used the transition to send a message that he was breaking away from Ronald Reagan. Now, the cabinet choices, they were the expected, with one major league misfire, John Tower. Tower had gotten himself embroiled in scandals of Pentagon procurement and defense spending procurement. Bush held on to him longer than he should have, sent him to the floor for a Senate vote that was turned down, and it was a very young Dick Cheney coming out of the Ford administration who was chosen to be Bush's Secretary of Defense. But the answer's not in the cabinet appointments. The answer to most questions about the Bush administration isn't even in the cabinet. It's in the staff. Bush chose a staff that was decidedly anti-Reagan. At the top of the anti-Reagans was Brent Scowcroft. Brent Scowcroft had been a consistent critic of Reagan's foreign policy, and people in the know, they weren't looking at Jim Baker at State. When Brent Scowcroft was brought on at the NSC, they firmly believed that Bush was going to turn away from a harsh policy towards the Soviet Union and, in the parlance of the time, go soft. And Bush kind of let it slip himself when he turned, and if you look at the tape, he turns when he delivers the line, "a kinder, gentler America," and he turns and looks Reagan right in the eye. And the message was absolutely clear. The level of rancor in the transition was absolutely unexpected. They threw out the Reaganites, and the conservatives are now more than just uneasy. They're throwing Reagan out of the temple. So the conservatives are now incredibly nervous as they begin to interact with Bush and his policies. Was Bush's a conservative domestic policy? Well, this is a term that John Sununu, who came on as chief of staff, used to describe Bush's policies. It had to be a limited agenda. The Democrats had a 10-vote majority in the Senate and an 89-vote majority in the House. The only way that Bush could affect that was with the veto, and he did. He did 44 vetoes, 43 of them were upheld. And that did stave off what could have been a much more liberal agenda. But there were, on balance, few successes in domestic policy. Bush faces a particularly difficult issue with the issue of the burning of the American flag. Texas versus Johnson, the Supreme Court case that says that this is constitutional. This is the actual moment outside the Houston Convention when Johnson burned the American flag and then was arrested violating Texas state law. Bush rails in public against the Supreme Court, tries to get a constitutional amendment against flag burning, then a law is passed, the Flag Protection Act, and then that's declared unconstitutional by the court in U.S. versus Eichmann. Bush, by the time he's done, he believed this and shared this belief with the conservatives, but he couldn't bring it home. He couldn't protect the American flag, and that was going to be remembered as well. So were his missteps in education. Now, who do you see in this picture who's pretty young and intent? Look at this guy. If I was Bush, I'd be watching my back. But instead, Bill Clinton and Terry Branstad of Ohio helped Bush with this conference, and Bush sent him one of his very, very nice notes afterwards. But the problem with Education 2000, which was Bush's very complicated plan to remake the education system, and it was not the grandfather of No Child Left Behind, was that there wasn't any money. The burden had to be shouldered by the states, and essentially what Bush said was the states should pay for it, and the states said, ha-ha, not a chance. Problems with the deficit also hurt the drug policy. Drug policy under the Reagan administration had been say no to drugs. That's pretty cheap. It's inexpensive. It was a Nancy Reagan-run administration effort. Bush wanted to go beyond it, but he was forced by the conservative wing of the party to accept as his drug czar former Education Secretary Bill Bennett. And Bill Bennett, who has never met a TV camera that he didn't like, was the same way in the Bush administration and forced upon Bush a harsher, faster drug policy that he wanted. He also pushed this speech, which you might remember, where Bush holds up a bag of crack cocaine. That's crack cocaine in the President of the United States' hand. And says, we got this in Lafayette Park from an arrest. What they did was they went down by Union Station in Washington, D.C., found a drug dealer, put him in a car, brought him up to Lafayette Park, got him out, got the crack from him, and let him go. Bush didn't know any of this until it broke, and Bill Bennett just simply rode the tide of the PR. Drug policy wasn't taken seriously for the rest of the administration. Now, there were some successes. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, but they would not have happened without the help of the Democratic-controlled Congress. Neither of these measures are initiated by the administration. The conservatives then are taking a look at this and saying, this is hardly the stuff of the so-called Reagan Revolution. Maybe we can get our tax cuts. No area of domestic policy angered conservatives more than Bush's decision to reverse his campaign pledge on tax hikes and go back on Read My Lips. What's often missed in the blather and garbage that pretends to be scholarly analysis of the Reagan years is how disappointed conservatives had become with Ronald Reagan by 1988. $2.7 trillion in deficits, $140 billion paid per year on interest alone. And as seen, the deficit had held a large portion of Bush's domestic policy hostage. Bush really wanted to make up that ground so that he could do what he wanted to do, which was to increase defense spending. He was getting pressure from Cheney to do that, and to have some domestic policy, but he couldn't. The gap was too wide. Dan Rostenkowski, a Bush intimate, told Bush that he could have a year's grace period before Rosti came after him and started saying publicly that there's no way that we make up the deficits without raising taxes. But in 1991, in that cycle, Bush was faced with a Hobson's choice. You either go back on Read My Lips, or you face the greatest deficits in American history to that point, and you can't afford a hot dog from the federal government. And he was told by his budget director, Richard Darman, that you have to find a way to go back on Read My Lips and go to the Senate Democrats with a concession that you will accept revenue enhancements. Bush does. And then comes one of the most wonderful moments in the Bush presidency. Newt Gingrich, who was at that point in time, Newt Gingrich, that should really explain everything. Gingrich goes, as I think he was majority whip at the time, he's supposed to come to the session with the press where this whole thing is unveiled. Newt Gingrich turns around and walks out on the President of the United States. Well, he had read the American people well, because Newt understood that it wasn't the money, it was going back on the issue. And the conservative wing of the party began to look at George Bush and literally abandon him. The conservatives are walking out on their president. But what could he have done differently? Nothing. Without sacrificing fiscal responsibility. There's going to be many moments in the Bush administration where he does the right thing, bequeaths Clinton a stronger economy, and takes a knife for it. What about conservatives and foreign policy? What was President Bush's worldview? Well, it was very complex. I wasn't surprised when the times when I met with the former president that he didn't want to talk about the ADA. He wanted to talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall. He wanted to talk about China. He wanted to talk about all of these things. It's complex. It blended the us versus them goodwill immediately rid the world of evil view that had been stoked in the fires of World War II with a very unexpected, temperate, careful approach to communism. Let's look at both of them. First of them, from communism. Ronald Reagan had angered conservatives to the point of apoplexy by meeting and dealing with Mikhail Gorbachev, particularly the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987. The Gipper, who had said that it was an evil empire, had done a complete about-face. And conservatives hoped that Bush would change things. He does not. He picks up almost immediately where Bush or where Reagan left off. On the 15th of April, 1989, at the death of a Chinese leader sympathetic to the dissidents who were gathering in Tiananmen Square, led students to pour into this massive open area. And on June 4th, Deng Xiaoping clears out the square, 3,000 protesters killed, 10,000 wounded. I bring this to you for perspective.
仿佛一切都没发生过。
历史事件的含义不会自动呈现出来，而总是由人来解释的。6月5日清晨的这一瞬间将成为永恒的历史象征。
Watch the tank
后
drive
来
now.
他消
Try
失
to get
在
out of
人
the
群
way.
中，下落不明，连姓名都难以确认。对于全世界千百万的电视观众来说，这一时刻的含义非常清楚。这是人类良知
Conservatives wanted
向无
Bush
形的国
to
家机器挑战
attack the Chinese regime for the barbarity of Tiananmen Square. And Bush would not do it.
只是截然相
He
反。
refuses to issue a blanket condemnation, sends Scowcroft on a secret mission. It inflames the conservatives that Bush does not criticize China for this.
能够阻挡得了吗？摄像机拍下的这个画面，从西。
Nor does Bush reverse course with Gorbachev. After a 5-month pause that gave the conservatives false hope, Bush jumps in to negotiations with Gorbachev at the Texas A&M speech, the NATO summit, the C6 summit of Malta. Why? Because Bush wants Gorbachev's neutrality in world hotspots, and he knows Gorbachev needs money, and he's willing to trade. That interesting anecdote that was shared with us earlier about Barbara Bush saying to, if that story isn't true, it should be. Yeah, about Barbara Bush saying, well, he didn't know that he's not responsible for it. In terms of the fall of communism, who or what ended the Cold War is a subject of debate. But at the moment that the conservatives were claiming victory, George Bush would not gloat. He didn't sound elated. He told Leslie Stahl in a press conference, I'm just not an emotional kind of guy. He didn't want to rub Gorbachev's face in it. He refused to do it. It inflames conservatives who thought that he should go over and, in the words of the senator at the time, the senator from Missouri, Dick Gephardt, said George Bush should go over and dance on the remnants of the Berlin Wall. Bush would not do that. So he has a very laid-back, almost moderate approach to communism, but not so to dictators. Bush clearly didn't see China and Russia as evil in the way the conservatives did. Not in the sense of a Hitlerian type evil that he had fought against in World War II. For that, you had to be able to personify it, to have an enemy, to have someone that you could strike out at, find, arrest, trap in the Vatican embassy, Manuel Noriega. But what if they wouldn't be caught? What if they were Hitler-like, but you couldn't catch him? Saddam Hussein touched every one of George Bush's buttons. The president for life. My favorite Saddam Hussein story, he wanted a law degree. My kid's in law school. I had to think this through. He wanted a law degree, so he shows up into the exams with 10 bodyguards all armed. He got his law degree. By God, I will make fire eat half of Israel if it tries to do anything to Iraq. He took the country to the brink of economic chaos in the Iran-Iraq war, and then invaded Kuwait, a country the size of New York, with more oil than 72% of the world. This invasion and the setting fire of the oil fields at Safwan really made it clear to Bush that he was facing world evil. Bush made it absolutely clear to me that whether the United Nations said that he could or not, whether the Congress said that he could or not, he was going into Kuwait. He was ready. Now, the United Nations said he could, and so did Congress. But Bush was clear that he would have done this unilaterally. The sanctions, Operation Desert Shield, Baker's meeting with Tariq Aziz, all the phone calls to all of the coalition, that was just stalling, buying time for the formation of a coalition force. Why? Bush calls Saddam Hussein Hitler in formal speeches 74 times, a rapist 26 times, evil 362 times. Our cause is just, our cause is moral, our cause is right. It was good versus evil. There was nothing to this decision for George Bush. It was simple. But did he win? I asked Brent Scowcroft if he would answer a question for me. Did we win the Persian Gulf War? This was his answer. A case can be made on both sides. At the peace treaty at Safwan, Norman Schwarzkopf literally gives the store away, allows Saddam Hussein to keep all of his attack helicopters, which allows Saddam Hussein to turn those helicopters on the Kurds for their opposition and come very close to exterminating them. What did the administration do? They sent Jim Baker to a Kurdish refugee camp. He was there for 6 minutes. Of course, the biggest piece of the argument for failure was that we didn't go into Baghdad and we didn't get Saddam. But everyone I interviewed made it absolutely clear, that this was never a war aim. One who I can't attribute said to me, if a bomb fell on his head, we'd have a party. But we never aimed. Why didn't Bush go in? Because he wanted to make sure that the 100-day or the 100-hour promise was kept and the Vietnam War syndrome. But there's an equal and opposing list for it being a success. I mean, numerically, we absolutely won. There was no question about it. Americans only lost 148 killed in action. Iraqi losses were close to 22,000 dead. On a more subtle note, Bush was able to keep Israel out of the war, dealing with the recently deceased Prime Minister Shamir, who wanted to retaliate to the Scud missiles. Bush keeps them out and avoids a wider war in the area. And he ends it on time. It ends the Vietnam War syndrome. So the problem with the war, because everybody says he won a war, so he should have won the election. This wasn't the type of victory that's going to guarantee you anything. There's too much over here. There's way too much over here to say this is going to carry you to re-election, even against a governor of Arkansas with no foreign policy experience. And besides, he had a really lousy year in 1991. This was Bob Teeter's assessment to me of how they felt at the end of 1991. Everything went wrong. Lee Atwater died of a brain tumor, taking that voice out of the campaign. Bush collapses while he is jogging in April and is diagnosed with Graves' disease. There are many people who said that took the energy right out of the campaign. What many people feel to be the biggest disaster of the Bush presidency. It literally took whatever votes for women that Bush had and threw them right out the window. He wasn't going to get significant support in the African American community, but he had been making inroads because of the education bill with women. This destroyed it. Gorbachev falls from power, and Bush stays his friend, his close ally, right to the very end, and conservatives are just pounding their head against the table saying, why don't you give this guy up? And then the economy went flushing. I love this cartoon. This was from 1991, but it applies today. Nobody knows how to fix the economy. The Bush White House didn't know how to fix the economy. In reality, Bush had fixed the economy. Bush had because of his decision to retract Read My Lips, he would bequeath to the president who followed him a very strong economy, but it wasn't in time. And this all fed this feeling of angst in Washington, gridlock. Remember the check kiting scandal? I'm up on Capitol Hill the day that the check kiting scandal, when everybody's with the bank and the check and the House credit union. And there's a very famous congressman. He's running down the hall, waving his checkbook, saying, "I didn't write any bad checks. I didn't write any bad checks." You know, like where's CNN when I need them? This feeling is, of course, going to feed into the phenomenon that became known as Ross Perot. And then this one's just for fun, but it takes somebody out of the campaign. This guy decides to take Air Force One for a joyride and sell stamps, or go and buy stamps for his collection all over the country, and he has to fire John Sununu. It couldn't have been any worse of a year. So the question that you've asked me to answer is really very simple. Winning a war was not enough going into 1992. Now, if you talk to the Bush people, they blame the press. If you talk to any president, they blame the press. If you talk to any politician, they blame the press. This is a wonderful picture because I guarantee you George Bush, who hated interchange with the press, is lying. He is not having a good time. I don't know what he's doing, but he's not having a good time. And Marlon Fitzwater is just like, get this microphone out of here. But it wasn't just the press. Nor was it, it's the economy, stupid. And nor was it, it's broken and anybody can fix it. There was more to it than this. In my classroom, I told this story on the radio today. I'm sitting in a classroom at Cazenovia College. We're watching the debates. I'm watching the debates with sleeping college students. You know, the situation normal. I bought pizza, so they're all falling asleep. It gets to this point in the debate. Bill Clinton has just stunned everybody by getting out of his seat. You might remember that moment. That was actually a very important moment in the debates. And Bush does this. I jumped out of the chair and I start screaming, "It's over, it's over." I woke the kids up. It's over. And I really meant it because this showed a detachment that was on a level of astounding for me. So certainly one of the reasons that he lost, and Bush did talk to me quite frankly about this, was because of the Graves' disease, his heart really wasn't in it. His staff did not serve him well. It was a terrible campaign staff after Atwater died. Baker came in too late to fix it, and Baker was incapable of fixing it. This was why he got beat. Pat Buchanan bled him dry. The conservatives left him. They had had enough. George Bush was not one of them. Pat Buchanan was. And Buchanan stays in the race because he's funded by conservatives, Republican conservatives, who want to weaken George Bush. Republican conservatives were even more willing to vote for Bill Clinton. In 1992, 27% of Republicans and 68% of independents vote for Clinton. They finally abandoned him. Deficits. They had a firebrand who could energize him, Buchanan, and Dukakis-like. Bush did not respond. So the answer to that is, it's easy. The right left. The problem with college professors is that even when they hit the end, they can't stop. We are, as a group, a bunch of gaseous windbags. So let me talk about his legacy and say two things. Here's a rather eclectic assortment of human beings. Different political parties, different times. All of them have been labeled by historians as activists. Charisma, charm, candor, class, forcefulness, the great communicator, in a class by himself. Americans seem to believe that unless you are an activist president, active, you're a failure. That's nonsense. The vision thing. Bush was hung out to dry because he didn't have a vision. He had a vision. It was a very limited vision. George Bush was never going to be a great communicator like Ronald Reagan because he didn't want to be. He did not feel that that was the role of the President of the United States. He was not an activist. He was not a guardian president. He was not passive, and he was not a failure. He leaves a balance sheet that is clearly balanced. Domestic policy was held hostage by deficits, but there's two notable achievements. The tax hikes were responsible policy. There's a balanced approach to worldwide communism, a refusal to countenance dictators, but it was a war with a flawed peace. It was an honorable administration, but it did not fight adequately for its own survival in 1992. It was a balanced administration. Hardly the stuff that revolutions are made of. Not a bad legacy. And so, my good friend Fred Woodward is here. He is the director of the University Press of Kansas. Fred, what do we got to do now? What should scholars be writing about now? Well, the first thing they got to do is fix my book. First of all, buy it. But then get somebody to fix it and bring it up to date with the significant new archival openings at the Bush Library. There is no full biography of George H.W. Bush. There are several good ones that shortchange his early life or shortchange him in the presidency. But a new biography using the Bush material before the president passes is in order. But my favorite, there has to be, this is just too unique a moment in American history, a good biography of 41 and 43. There's some garbage out there. You know, family history, the Kitty Kelly type stuff. But 41 and 40, using the Presidential Library, which will open up at SMU in Dallas, I believe this year, and start looking at this as a uniquely won presidency. I hope you had a good time. I certainly did. Thank you.